Good morning, everyone. This morning's reading is from Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 3 and 17 to 23. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi,
"Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I might find favor."
She said to her,
"Go, my daughter."
So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her,
"Why did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you."
So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, saying,
"The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz."
Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law,
"Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead."
Naomi also said to her,
"The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin."
Then Ruth the Moabite said,
He even said to me, "Stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest."
Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law,
"It is better, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman. Otherwise, someone might bother you in another field."
So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. The word of the Lord.
You can clap for her, that's all right, yes. Yeah. I saw some of you tentatively like, are we allowed to do this? Yes. So last week we had a lot of fun. We played some games. We did all sorts of interactive things. This week I kind of fell down the rabbit hole with the research. So there's way too much text in this, and I'll just say that at the beginning. And we're going to be tripping and falling down the rabbit hole a little bit. When I get into research and really get into it and looking into a passage and finding the things, I start saying, oh, this fits with here, and oh, that fits with there, and this goes to that passage. And especially Old Testament stories, they're all connected and they build on each other. So there's all this Old Testament stuff that to understand this story, we kind of have to dive into a little bit. So this is going to be a little bit less interactive, a little bit less fun, but we're going to be diving into a lot of text today. So I'm going to apologize just right up the front. That's what we're doing. There's a simple message that sort of comes out through, and to get to that, we're going to go through other stuff and then come back to it. And that is, the simple message is that God set up the law in a way that redeems people, that sets people right, that brings people back to being healthy and whole and being able to have a sustained life in community. And that's kind of the whole message. So if you fall asleep and everything else, you'll hear I'm coming back to that. But I want to jump in here with this story. And I'm going to be focusing mainly more on Boaz's role, but with most of this story, it's told from the women's point of view. So we're going to meet Boaz a little bit through the story, but if you've noticed, the main section here in 2 that Boaz is in, I've skipped, and we've had more of the conversations about Boaz. Next week, when you come back, we're going to be really focusing on the relationship between Boaz and Ruth and their interaction. So we're going to see more of that and talk about more of that next week. Problem with this, though, is you kind of have to know the whole story to dive into some of it. So if you get to the end of this and you're like, I'm confused, I don't know the whole story, please go read the whole book. It's 4 chapters. It won't take you more than about 10 minutes to read the whole thing. It's a really fascinating story, and we're going to be jumping into parts of it. And in many ways, we're going to be jumping into one of the key parts that helps hold this whole story together and helps it to be understood. But let's jump in at the beginning. And there's a number of places in here where there's kind of this wink, wink, nudge, nudge kind of thing going on, because God isn't mentioned. It's sort of alluded to that God is working. And we'll see that as we go through here. So now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So we set it up here right at the beginning that this is a family member. He's wealthy, and he's connected to Naomi's husband. This is going to come in here really important in a little bit. So Ruth, and it's interesting, if you notice how many times I mentioned Ruth, it also always mentions that she's a Moabite. It's like the story just can't let us forget, this is a Moabite woman. And remember last week we got into what was the view of Moabite women. So it's constantly that the writer of this story is reminding us, hey, remember who this woman is, remember her background, remember how we all think about Moabite women. Which if you missed last week, the thoughts of Moabite women is very, very bad. Go back and listen to the sermon there, I won't go into it now. So Ruth, the Moabite, says to Naomi, let me go to the fields and glean. If you don't know what gleaning is, it's going along and picking up the stuff that has fallen. So the people who are harvesting have dropped some things, and there's some gleaning that happens. You pick up the stuff on the side. We'll go into more of that next week as well. And I've lost my place. Let me go to the fields and glean among the ears of grain, and this would have been the barley harvest, behind someone whose, and here it's interesting, in whose sight I may find favor. So yes, she's going to get food, but here it is in the back of her mind, going and looking for someone in which I will find favor. We're going to hold on to that, and it'll come up here in a little bit. And often in the Hebrew, it says sort of she or the woman, and it doesn't clarify who it is. So in some places, it's clear. So in these first couple of bits, it's clear which woman is being named. When we get to the next section, it says she, but it's not always clear which she it's referring to. And that's kind of the fun of dealing with Hebrew, is it sort of doesn't always clarify, and you have to do some work to figure out which person it's talking about. So she, Naomi, said to her, Ruth, go, my daughter, so that she, Ruth, went. And she, Ruth, came and gleaned in the field behind the reaper. As it happened. Now, this is a phrase that's repeated often. And it's this interesting, as it just happened, this is what happened. Well, this is sort of the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is the providence of God moving. So anytime you're reading this story and you see, it just so happened, well, that's the saying, this is God making it happen. So as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephod. It's just a lot of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took and gave what she had left over after she had herself been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, and you can just almost read this as she's bouncing up and down, so excited of seeing this here. So I can't read this really, really fast, but think of it as this is like rapid fire questions coming out because she's just so excited here. So, where did you glean today, and where have you been working? Blessed is the man who took notice of you. Right away there, you see that finding favor? It's, somebody's taken notice of you and given you favor. Okay, so the rapid fire questions here. And it's interesting as we look at Ruth's response. She could have just said, right away, it was Boaz. But she kind of waits to the very end of all she says to name him. So here it says, let me find it again. The name of the man of whom I have worked today is Boaz. Okay, we get him. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, Blessed by the Lord, whose kindness and has not forsaken the living and the dead. Now, this is one of those interesting spots where it's not really clear who she's talking about. Is this, she's saying that Boaz is blessed because he's done this, or is it blessed is Boaz because God has done this? And in the Hebrew, it's not very clear. So is this Boaz that's being blessed here, or is it God? And it's also interesting when it says, for he has not forsaken the living and the dead. I've read a number of different commentators that went back and forth. Some of them say here that she's specifically saying, you haven't forgotten the living, us, and dead, our husbands that have all died. Or is this just a saying? Some of the scholars say, this is just a saying that they say, blessed is this person who didn't forget the living and the dead. And that was just a saying that was said. Either way, it's very interesting in this story that there's this blessing given because someone is caring for the living and recognizing that they are in struggles because that some others have died. So Naomi said to her, "This man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Now, this is the NRSV translation. I would love for you to grab a Bible or your phone and look up this part right here. So this is chapter 2, and we are looking in, that's end of 20. What does it say? What's the wording that's used there? In your translation, what does it say there instead of our nearest kin, or maybe yours does? Anybody have that? Guardian redeemers. Ooh, okay. Any other ones? Kinsman redeemer. Any others that you have there? Just relative. Just relative, okay. So we're going to be working with this word here, and we'll come back to this in just a minute. But let's finish this off. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, now this is interesting, we skipped the part where she was actually talking with Boaz. Boaz says to her, "While you're with me, stay in this field and stay close to my women so you're not bothered." And it's interesting, when Ruth comes back and reports to her mother-in-law, instead of saying to the women, she's looking in some ways for a husband, and she says to her mother-in-law, "Oh, he said, stay close to his young men." Now, the author doesn't really give us any hint why she says this, but I just went, she's not quoting him correctly. And it's interesting that Boaz and Naomi give the same advice to Ruth. So Naomi says to Ruth, to her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go with his young women. Otherwise, someone might bother you in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. So this is the part of the story that's set up for us. And I want to focus in on this word here of, what does it say? Nearest relative, what was yours again, Callum? Guardian redeemer, or the other one I think was kinsman redeemer. So this word here in the Hebrew looks like this, and at the bottom there, let's see, does this have a little pointer here? So here's the Hebrew word. Down here is how you would pronounce that. Good luck. I couldn't, so I'll leave that to you. But it basically translates as a kinsman redeemer or a family member that's closely related, but there's something about this redeemer that's going on. And to figure some of this out, we have to look back at some of the Older Testament stories around this word. Now, this is, when you go and look things up as a pastor, and especially in the days before there was a lot of technology, you would go and look at Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. And I have 2 of these that are huge, they're thick. They were way too much to move over here, so I left them in the US. Often, I have set them down and used them as my monitor to get up high enough because they're huge, big books. When I was in seminary, I had professors that say, "Don't look up stuff online." I don't know why. They just never wanted us to look up things online. They always sent us to the books. So we would pull out these heavy books and we would go through. And always when we were looking up words, we went to Strong's Concordance. So here we have, looking up this word, what does it say? A primitive root, and by the way, you can find it all online for free. So I did. So a primitive root, to redeem, according to, and I don't know why it says Oriental law, but that's what was in Strong. So anyway, of kinship. So here it is. To be the next of kin, and as such, to buy back a relative's property and to marry his widow. Now, it sort of leaves it there, but it's interesting that it names these 2 parts, because really, these 2 parts of the idea of the kinsman redeemer come from 2 separate laws. One comes from the book of Deuteronomy, one comes from Leviticus. They somewhat merge, but not really. They're 2 separate rules, but in Ruth, they seem to just be mashed together. We take them and we say, well, this one and that one, they go together. And a lot of the commentators say, well, this isn't really the way that either one of these laws or teachings were given. But in Ruth, the author just says, these are the same. But we have these two different parts. The one in Deuteronomy, now I loved this when I was looking it up, and I got confused to begin with because did you notice one is Deuteronomy 25, the other one is Leviticus 25. So I was constantly getting it mixed up until I was like, oh, right, same chapter, different books. So the one from Deuteronomy really is around marrying a widow. This is the Levirate marriage, and it's about, in many ways, the carrying on when someone has, when a male has died and hasn't produced a male heir, having his name continued on so that the brother will marry, and we'll get into this in a minute, so that there is a son that carries on the dead man's name going forward. The other one, in Leviticus, is much more about land being redeemed, about debts are being sold into slavery, and it's really about when somebody falls into hard times, a family member is able to redeem them or buy them back or buy the property back so it stays in the family. Now, the interesting thing is most of this chapter is dealing with different parts of it, and you really have to understand the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee is when all sorts of land and property and debts are all forgiven and they all go back. So it's interesting, if you're somebody who likes math and thinking about it, part of it is it goes through and it lays out, you have to count so many years until the year of Jubilee, and the field gets sort of reduced every year you get closer to that on how much you pay. So if you're further away from the year of Jubilee, and when you have to give the field back, the field's worth more. But if it's just like a year before the year of Jubilee, you're not paying much for it because you only are going to have it for a year, and then it's going to be forgiven and given back. So that's kind of how that story works. It's a really interesting one. If you like math, you like numbers, you like sort of thinking about that kind of stuff, this is an interesting passage to go and read. But both of them here are mashed together in this story. We're going to start off with this first one coming out of Deuteronomy 25. But when I think of this, I don't think of the Old Testament's passage to begin with. I think of this one here in Matthew, and we're going to look at that one first. So this is Matthew 22, 23 through 30. When I think of the story of Ruth, and I heard, oh, he's got to marry the deceased man's wife, I right away go to this story, and maybe this one's most familiar to you as well. The same day, the Sadducees came to Jesus, and there let me back up. Came to Jesus saying, there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, so they're trying to trip him up. And you always in the book of Matthew can tell who somebody is by how they address Jesus. If they address Jesus as Master and Lord, the author is giving you a hint here. This person knows who Jesus is. He's correctly identifying Jesus. This person is doing what they're supposed to be doing. But then there's the people who name Jesus as teacher. And you right away know, they're kind of disrespecting Jesus. They're, okay, he's teacher, but they're not going to actually name him as who he is, God, as Master and Lord. So here we have, teacher. Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up a child for his brother. So that's kind of what we're going for here. And it goes on there, and they do this thing with, well, there were 7 brothers, they all married the same woman. When they die, which one is married to her? And I love Jesus' response here at the end. So jumping down to 29 there. You are wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. Oh, okay. Jesus is getting feisty here. And he goes on and talks there. So where does this come from? Where is it that Moses is giving these instructions? And in our world, these instructions just sound really, really odd. I think about this, if my brother died, well, I'm glad he has a son. I wouldn't have to do it. So I'm off the hook. But if he hadn't been, marrying my sister-in-law just seems really, really odd. So we hear this is the part from Deuteronomy. When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased should not be married outside of the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. So that's sort of the main point here, is that we're not losing the family line here. So it's a way of saying we're keeping all of these family lines, which in many ways has to do with property, which we'll come to in the other one. Because when they moved out of Egypt and they moved into the land, each family was given a bit of land. But we don't get that part here. As we keep going, it's interesting to read this next part, and this is where I started falling down some rabbit holes, but we'll come to that in a moment. But if a man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, then the brother's widow shall go to the elders at the gate. And now it's interesting, at the gate, anytime in a city or a town when there was business to be done or a trial that needed to be run or you had a dispute that needed to be settled, you always go to the gate to settle it. So here they go to the gate. So she goes to the elders at the gate and says, my husband's brother refuses to what's that word? That one. His brother's name in Israel. So in other words, hey, he's not willing to keep his brother's name here. He will not perform the duties of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, I have no desire to marry her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elder, will pull off his sandal. As soon as I got to that, I went, oh, because if you know the story of Ruth, and we're coming to, this is where it starts to, I think, make a link. So, pull off his sandal, spit in his face, and declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And throughout Israel his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. Oh. I started looking at this and I went, oh, there's some links here to the story of Ruth. But I also started getting into it, and there's some links here to the story of Judah and of Tamar. But that is for another time. I really could have gone into so much of the links back and forth here. This sounds like the story of Tamar and Judah. And it's interesting because eventually Tamar gets what was supposed to happen. Judah has 2 kids with her, and one of them ends up being the grandfather, or is it the great-grandfather, of Boaz. So it's Boaz comes out of the Tamar line. So if you are knowing the story of Ruth, you've probably heard the story of Tamar. So there's all sorts of connections there. But let's stay with the connections here for a moment. So there's a couple of things that I noticed here. It's happening at the gate. The elders are present here, and his sandal's being taken off, and there's sort of this insult that's left there. Now, when we come to the story of Ruth, Boaz has an encounter with Ruth, actually several. He agrees to take her to be her redeemer, to marry her, but then at the last minute says, oh, I need to work this out with another relative who's closer. So, this is picking up after they've had some conversations. And it says this, no sooner had Boaz gone to the gate, so he's going to the same place, and sat down. There, the next of kin, it's interesting, it doesn't name the next of kin really. The best translation of what it does call him is so-and-so. He's so unimportant, he's just so-and-so. But this other guy who's closely related, more closely related, just so-and-so has come, and Boaz spoke with him and as he was passing by. So Boaz said, come over and sit down, and then Boaz took 10 men, so again we've got the elders here, of the town and sat down here. Now it was the custom, and this is another spot where there's a lot of debate. I wasn't able to find any place that says that there's a custom that they take off their shoes. It seems to be that we get from Ruth that there was this custom that does it, but we have no other evidence, at least I couldn't find any, that there was this custom. So it's interesting that it says here, there's this custom, former times of Israel, concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. One took off the sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, acquire it yourself, he took off his sandal. Which there's a lot of debate. Is this linking to the other one? And is this sort of saying our total disregard for this guy because he's like that brother-in-law who didn't? So it's not quite spitting in his face, but it is sort of this, the author leaves us a little like this guy wasn't doing what he's supposed to be doing. But Boaz was. I fell down the rabbit hole on that one quite a bit. But I found it very interesting. Sometimes when I look at all sorts of different books, and I have 5 or 6 of them out, and I'm looking through all of them, and I try to summarize it, sometimes I go to the internet and I find sources that everybody has, and it does a better job summarizing it than what I can do pulling it all together. So I'm using here from Wikipedia. It's not a great source if you're starting off, but if you're summarizing things, sometimes it's not bad. So since there was no heir to inherit Elimelech's land, custom required a close relative, usually the dead man's brother. Now it's interesting, dead man's brother, which we don't get in the story because he doesn't have a brother. So the dead man's brother to marry the widow and deceased in the order to continue his family line. Quotes it from Deuteronomy there. This relative was called, now how would you say that? Goel? So it's interesting, that word is often used to speak of God as God is the Redeemer of us, or of Israel, or of humanity. The kinsman redeemer. And Boaz was not Elimelech's brother, nor Ruth his widow. Scholars refer to this arrangement as Levirate-like. So Ruth has sort of been mashing this together, and it's not fully in the way that the law in Deuteronomy would say. A complication arises in the story when a relative that another man is closer relative to Elimelech than Boaz, therefore, the first claim on Ruth. This conflict is resolved through the custom that requires land to stay in the family. A family could, now this is where we're starting to jump to that other model. A family could mortgage the land to ward off poverty. So in our story, Ruth and Naomi, it's not that they don't have anything. They do have land, but as two women, they don't have the ability to work that land in a way that will sustain them in life. So it's coming in this story that they are selling that part of the land so they're able to sustain life. So here's where we start getting that part. But the law requires a male relative to purchase it back into the family. This is from Leviticus. When Boaz meets the near kinsman at the city gate, the place where the contracts are settled, the kinsman initially agrees to purchase Elimelech and now Naomi's land, but upon hearing he must take Ruth as his wife, he withdraws his offer. It's interesting that it names these two. As we look at the second one here, it doesn't talk about marriage at all in this part. I thought, surely there's a verse somewhere, and it's from 25 through 55. Surely there's some mention of marrying your widow or your brother-in-law's widow, but it just doesn't happen here at all. But there's so many other interesting parts that are mentioned in this passage. And almost all of them start off in a section like these two. If any one of your kin falls into difficulty, or in the next one, if any of your kin fall into difficulty, and then it usually has an explanation of all the different things you have to do, and then the legal things of how close you are to the day of the year of Jubilee. But all of these start the same way. So you could many ways say in Leviticus, what's going on here is there's concern for when your relatives fall into difficulty. And it's amazing to see the different things that are named here. So they sell a piece of property, or if they become dependent on you for some reason, and it doesn't necessarily name why. And there's all these rules of how you must care for your relative who falls into difficulty. For me, this is the most amazing part of this whole story, is that from the very beginning, God has put into place all of these laws, and at the heart of them is when somebody falls into difficulty, when they can't support themselves, when they don't have the means for a life that is sustained well, you as their relative have the responsibility to come and care for them. Oh, I don't remember why I put this slide here. We're going to skip it, because I don't remember why I was having that one there. Yep, I don't remember. We're going to skip it. All right. So we have these two different parts. And really, when we come down to it, both models are about restoring people. God's law redeems those who are fallen. From the very beginning, we have this set into the law. And Jesus, when he comes, he is not different from God. Jesus is God and acts in the exact same way. Often when we think of Jesus as redeeming of us, though, we often super spiritualize it. And we disconnect it from money, land, wealth, marriage. And yet, so often, we have things that we fall into hard times. And we as a community are called to be like the people in the Old Testament. When our relative falls into hard times, how do we step in and help redeem them? When they fall into debt and we're doing all right, do we pay that debt for them? And for us as the church, we are called to be family with each other. I find it interesting to think about the Amish, and my mom was telling me about this. The Amish take this kind of stuff very, very seriously. And if somebody is a bad farmer, if I was out there as a farmer, I would be this guy. They asked me as they were talking about putting in things to the manse, do you and Carla like to garden? Do you want a lot of garden space or you want more grass space? And Carla and I said, we want grass. We can cut stuff. I would be the farmer that would need some help. The other Amish that live around this bad farmer look at that and they say, this guy's struggling. He's not doing so good. He doesn't know when to water. He doesn't know when to weed. He doesn't know what he's doing. This makes the whole community look bad. So they all step in and they'll have farmers that will show up and come and farm the guy's land for him and teach him and help him. They have this idea as a community, if someone falls on hard times, it's our responsibility to step in and redeem the situation. We have a God that has set this up from the very beginning. God works and redeems us and invites us and actually has laws about how are we supposed to care for each other when we've fallen on hard times. I'm going to lead in a little bit here to communion because I see this as the major act of God saying, look, humanity has fallen on hard times. They've lost their way. They've been so caught in sin, and sin and death rule over them so much they can't buy themselves out of it. But I can. So God does. And Jesus comes, he lives his life in teaching us. He dies and is resurrected and sets us right. He redeems us and invites us to continue on in his ministry, continuing to invite others into that redeeming. This act of God that sets us right. And as I was thinking of a scripture to lead us into communion, I thought, I'll go to the New Testament. And then I thought, no, we've been in the Old Testament the whole time. We're going to stick with it. So another Old Testament passage here. And this is from Isaiah 44. Remember these things. Every time you hear Jacob and Israel, I want you to hear in many ways he's speaking about us or the people of God. So remember these things, Jacob and Israel. For you are my servant. I formed you. You are my servant, Israel. Do not forget me. I have swept away your rebellion like a cloud, your sins like a fog. Return to me. Or another way of saying that is repent. For I have redeemed you. Sing, heavens, for the Lord has done it. Shout, depths of the earth. Break forth into singing, mountains, forest, and every tree in it. For the Lord has redeemed Jacob and will be glorified in Israel. We come because we have a God who redeems us, who invites us to participate in that redemption of others. We come to communion. It is both our invitation to remember what God has done, but when we take up the cup, it is also that cup of the new covenant that invites us to continue that on in our world, to care for others as they have fallen into hard times. So come and participate in communion. Remember that God has redeemed us. The Lord has done it. And also invites us to participate in it.